Prior to the Enlightenment, most Europeans understood the universe and Earth history in terms of Genesis. The universe was intentionally created from nothing, while planet Earth was initially covered with water, from which the continents later emerged. With the entrance of creaturely rebellion and human sin, God imposed a curse of decay or decline upon the natural order. Thousands of years ago, God sent a catastrophic year-long worldwide flood that killed most of the life on Earth. Geology operated within the paradigm of catastrophism, the belief that, along with general gradual processes of erosion and weathering over long periods of time, major features of the Earth's surface were also produced quickly by unusual catastrophic events, such as volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, floods, and storms. Those who studied rocks professionally were familiar with the evidences for catastrophic events in the past. However, the men of the French Enlightenment wanted to discredit biblical supernaturalism, and to do so, they embraced an opposite philosophical scenario and then began imagining stories that would contradict the Bible at every possible point. Whereas Genesis begins with an eternal creator, a universe created from nothing, and a curse upon the natural order, secularists needed a story for the universe in which there was no eternal creator or curse upon nature. First, they imagined an eternal universe, filled with eternal matter and natural processes inherently organizing matter into ever higher levels of order, even life. Eventually, the second principle of thermodynamics and Hubble's redshift suggested that the universe did have a highly ordered original state, or an explosion from a central point, so the universe probably had a beginning after all. The redshift suggested explosion from a central point, so the eternal universe was replaced with belief in a Big Bang. It was imagined that all matter was at some point compressed into a space smaller than a subatomic particle, a singularity, and then exploded. But what force could compress all matter into that small of a space? Stephen Hawking suggested that the law of gravity could explain the whole thing. Well, gravity might fit the compression idea, but what overcame or turned off gravity so that the singularity exploded? That's a pretty bizarre idea to get your mind around. So the compression and explosion notion is waning in popularity. Lawrence Krauss has become a science celebrity by suggesting that the universe and all of its matter suddenly popped into existence from nothing. That eliminated the compression-explosion enigma, but nothing suddenly becoming everything sounds like science is drifting back towards Genesis 1, verse 1. Since God is forbidden, Krauss claims that a quantum fluctuation, a reconfiguration of quantum particles, did the job. I wish a quantum fluctuation would materialize a pizza on my table at dinner time, or a new car in my driveway, but the whole universe, no problem. Some physicists reject the quantum fluctuation model as optimistic fiction. The Bible tells us that the formation of the universe involves some kind of cosmic expansion, for Isaiah and Jeremiah mentioned God stretching out the heavens. Everything considered, God created the universe from nothing and expansion of the universe. It seems like Genesis was giving us a very brief but accurate picture of the origin of the universe after all. The Bible indicates that the universe was created within a 7-day week, and the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 suggest thousands of years of human history. Of course, the Enlightenment rejected the biblical timescale because they wanted to discredit the Bible and their scenario, inanimate matter being shaped by nothing more than unguided natural processes, is only conceivable with a very old universe and Earth to provide lots of time for trial and error to produce positive results. So, how old is the universe? At any given moment, there is an assumed answer that people are given, but the history of estimating the age of the universe shows how much imaginative speculation is involved. Every age estimate is based on selecting some observation or process, assuming that that one item is the valid clock for dating the entire universe, and then doing mathematical extrapolation. It also depends on which cosmological model is assumed in interpreting the data. There are three major cosmological models. In a closed universe, there is expansion for a while, but then it stops and slowly collapses on itself. In a flat universe, there is continual expansion, but gravity causes the rate of expansion to slow over time. In an open universe, the expansion continues forever at a constant rate.
If you ask me how far away those objects are, and hence how old, then the answer is the extraordinary one that you cannot calculate the distance, unless you know what cosmological model applies to the universe. The distance is so much on the Big Bang model, so much on the steady-state theory, and it has another value if the constants in the cosmological equations are different, and the universe is in a cyclical condition.
Those educated in the 1950s and 60s may remember that the general belief taught in school and in publications was 16 to 20 billion years. In 1977, the New York Times ran an article claiming the universe was 20 billion years old. The 1992 Encyclopedia Britannica article on cosmology offered dates for the age of the universe ranging from 8 to 20 billion years, depending on what current process one chose to extrapolate from. In October 1994, the Associated Press ran an article claiming the universe was 8 billion years old. Time magazine, November 7th of that year, contained an article claiming that it was between 8 and 13 billion years. In March 1995, Time magazine published another article confidently asserting that the universe began somewhere between 8 and 25 billion years ago. In January 1999, two different reports came out, one claiming that the universe could be no more than 10 billion years old, while the other claimed 15 to 18 billion years. In 2002, it was asserted that the age of the universe was now confirmed as just under 14 billion years. In 2016, what appears to be the current orthodox figure was given as 13.8 billion years. Current dogma has been defined, and all of the faithful have signed on, for now. Estimates of the size and age of the universe hinge on several things. We don't know what lies beyond what we can see, but the universe is really big. Universe expansion is assumed from the perceived redshift, a visual Doppler effect suggesting that galaxies are moving away from a central origin point. Arp and Sulentic have suggested that the redshift might not represent movement, because all matter in the same area should have the same redshift, and observations have found this to not be the case. Thus, the apparent redshift might be more about the age or gas emissions of distant bodies than movement. Also, trying to determine age from the assumed distance and time calculated against the speed of light might be questionable, because all measurements of the speed of light have involved mirrors, and Einstein suggested that light might travel instantaneously in one direction, if not interrupted or deflected. Finally, Einstein suggested, and evidence has confirmed, that gravity affects the speed at which time passes, so there are a lot of uniformity assumptions being made that may not be correct. Keep in mind that materialists can only think in terms of unguided natural processes, fumbling through many accidents to accomplish unlikely things. So for them, deep time and chance is a hill they are willing to die on. When you have an intelligent baker involved, a cake can be easily produced in a short time. However, for those with a pathological hatred for a divine baker, the only possible explanation is lots of time and chance. As I will demonstrate to be true in many areas of Enlightenment beliefs about nature, the materialists put on a very confident, we have it all figured out face when promoting their scenario to the trusting public. But occasionally the real scientists, who seriously and more open-mindedly ponder the accumulating evidence, admit that they do not have it all figured out. And these are the people we should listen to.
This was supposed to be the year when astronomers offered convincing answers to one of the most fundamental questions in science, the age of the universe. Instead, they have been thrown into a tizzy by developments in recent months that threaten much of what they thought they knew. Cosmology is in a state of flux, said American University astronomer Richard Berenson. The problem now is not only do we not have the right answer, we're not even sure we have the right question.
Genesis 1, 6 through 10 described the early Earth as covered with water, from which continents later appeared. So, to contradict that story, Emanuel Swedenborg, Immanuel Kant, and Simone Laplace imagined the nebular hypothesis, in which the Earth developed from a hot cloud of dust and gas that slowly cooled into a hot sun at the center, circled by smaller bodies, all covered with molten magma. The magma cooled over tens of millions of years into continents, after which water appeared. Since the nebular hypothesis contradicted Genesis, sounded plausible, and was assembled by respected Enlightenment promoters, secular European intellectuals bought into this story as eagerly as they bought into Darwinism. This is still presented to the public as how the Earth formed.
In the very beginning of Earth's history, this planet was a giant, red-hot, roiling, boiling sea of molten rock, a magma ocean.
When I tried to find exactly how much time was required for the Earth to cool before water was present, there seemed to be few willing to guesstimate an age. Secularists are okay with their assumed mythology being pretty fuzzy in many areas, but I found one article that suggested 50 million years. The overall evolutionary scenario is that at least 600 to 700 million years passed before the first life appeared. The nebular hypothesis was a perfect opposite and contradiction to Genesis, but one has to suspicion that this was all that it was, an imagined contradiction to Genesis. For several decades, reports have been accumulating that suggest Genesis was correct all along. The early Earth was covered with water, or at least had a considerable amount of surface water from the beginning. A noted geologist in California concluded that the Earth was 95% covered by oceans during the first 80% of its history, until a billion years ago, according to geological time estimates. A 2014 report published by National Geographic asserts that
our seas may have arrived much earlier on our planet than previously thought. The planet formed as a wet planet, with water on the surface. There was enough already here for life to have begun earlier than thought.
And a similar report was published in 2018.
The water sloshing in Earth's oceans and coursing through its canyons may have been with the planet since it first started taking shape, new research suggests.
Since evidence now seems to contradict a basic tenet of the nebular hypothesis, the Earth was covered with an ocean of molten magma for tens of millions of years before water could appear, it would seem appropriate to seriously reconsider this story. However, as long as contradicting Genesis is more important than observation and evidence, don't hold your breath. The Bible teaches a 7-day creation, with the first humans created on the 6th day, and then genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 indicate that humans have been around for roughly 6,000 years. Not only did the Enlightenment want to discredit that story, but their scenario of gradual naturalistic evolutionary development required a lot of uninterrupted time for unguided natural processes to slowly operate. They really need a very old Earth. But how do you justify such an old Earth? And how do you determine a new age for it? Since the nebular hypothesis asserted an early Earth covered with hot magma, it was logical to begin seeking an age for an older Earth by speculating on the amount of time required for magma to cool so that soil, water, and life could appear. When it comes to the age of the Earth, I do not believe that most people even grasp the relative range and massive size of deep time that has grown in the minds of men trying to get away from the biblical timescale. I've had to use 3 different timescale charts to portray how the imagined age of the Earth has increased over the last 250 years. Taken at face value, Genesis portrays Earth history in terms of around 6,000 years. Around 1780, George Louis Leclerc estimated the Earth to be 75,000 years old based on his estimates of the cooling of the molten Earth. But he also thought it could be as old as 3 million years. All of these figures disappear when we jump to the 1 billion year scale. In 1864, William Thomson estimated the Earth to be between 20 and 400 million years old. However, by 1897, he had revised that down to between 20 and 40 million years. Around 1860, John Phillips estimated the Earth to be 1 billion years old. Now we move up to the 5 billion year scale. Samuel Houghton suggested 2 different ages based on different calculations. The first was 2.5 billion years, but he later revised it down to 100 million years. Hermann von Helmholtz estimated the time for a nebular cloud to condense to the size of our Sun and came up with 100 million years. This figure was very popular with many geologists near the end of the 19th century. Bertram Boltwood provided the first radioactive decay system for dating uranium to lead. In 1907, he had test results showing the Earth to be between 220 million and 2.2 billion years old. In 1913, Arthur Holmes asserted that the oldest rocks were 1.6 billion years old. By 1927, he had revised this figure to 3 billion, and in the 1940s to 4.6 billion. In 1956, Claire Patterson dated meteorites in Arizona to 4.55 billion years old, and that became the current orthodox age for the Earth.
The Earth is, generally, estimated by modern scholars, to be more than 4 billion years old. This is not a mere guess, it is based largely upon a study of the disintegration of radioactive minerals. It is theorized that the true age of the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, formed at about the same time as the rest of our solar system.
It looks to me like the Enlightenment and modern era wanted to discredit the biblical timescale and justify a very different worldview. So men began speculating on ways to portray the Earth as increasingly older and older until they settled on 4.6 billion years, at least for now. Evidence not fitting into this scenario is simply ignored, like dinosaur soft tissue, supposedly 60 million years old, that has not fossilized but is still pliable and has blood chemicals. In the 1920s, radioactive decay rates for isotopes with long half-lives, assumed to be uniform over time, were coordinated with the strata ages, assumed to be true, in the geologic column.
Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first.
In 1926, the National Academy of Sciences declared that radioactive decay provided the only reliable means of determining the age of the Earth. This became the standard means of dating the Earth, strata, and fossils in terms of millions and billions of years. Radioactive isotopes like uranium-238 and 235 give off extra electrons, or decay, into two non-radioactive stable isotopes of lead. Assuming the decay rate to be constant over time, and the radioactive parent substance was 100% at the beginning, researchers then simply measure the ratio of current radioactive parent material to the stable daughter element. Radiometric dating is often applied to the rocks around fossils, and samples are always submitted with a target date, so laboratories have some idea of what kind of age they're trying to verify. However, there are factors that could distort the ratio and yield dates older than things really are. Radioactive material is known to leach out in water, which would impact the ratio and give an apparent age much older than reality. Whether it's the biblical flood or the evolutionary warm seas covering the land masses for long periods, everyone believes that the continents and their rocks have been underwater for a lengthy period. So it is possible that water leaching out radioactive parent material has generally caused the ratio to give exaggerated ages. Another question arises when the depth is not considered in how much radioactive decay has occurred. The best way to speed up a chemical reaction is to apply heat. Radioactive materials deep in the ground under warmer conditions have been shown to decay at a faster rate. A New Mexico deep core demonstrated that uranium-bearing zircons had lost all of their helium at the lowest and hottest levels. While a lot of assumptions are involved, if the Earth was 4.6 billion years old, then there should be a very small amount of helium left in these zircons. The actual amount suggests that the Earth might not be nearly as old. If geothermal heat sped up the decay process and distorted the ratio, and strata were deposited sideways, then deeper is not necessarily older. There is some evidence that isotope decay rates are not as constant as assumed. Researchers at Arizona State University have discovered that the uranium to lead decay rate has varied some over time. And emails between European nuclear power plant workers published in a physics journal indicated that they had found decay rates of numerous isotopes can vary quite a bit and from several different causes. Uniformitarian geology is based on the assumption of deep time.
Thus, if one assumes the passage of immense amounts of time, this will explain the presence of such diverse strata as exist in the Earth's crust.
And the public is now fully saturated with stories based on assuming gradual natural processes operating over deep time. However, few realize that deep time was more of a philosophical necessity than a conclusion based on observation and evidence. For if you reject intelligence to design and cause complexity in life, then you have no choice but to imagine the odds, and enough time for unguided natural processes to blindly stumble through a lot of trial and error until complex things just happen to occur and accumulate. The more complex something is, the more time is assumed to be required to make it believable. For materialists, deep time is an absolute necessity for their scenario to even sound plausible. We noted previously the very unlikely, and could we say impossible, chances of natural processes gathering and mixing the right ingredients in the right proportions and heating it at the right temperature to produce an edible cake. And a cake is nowhere near the complexity of a living cell, which materialists assure us could only have come about by unguided natural processes. But how, except in an imagination encouraged to think that way, does nothing more than a lot of time make impossible seem probable? And committed materialists would even say inevitable. Well, actually, the answer is fairly simple. Materialists operate by faith to a greater degree than many spiritual people. Due to their philosophical commitments, they simply exchanged faith in a miracle-working designer for faith in miracle-working deep time. If you wait long enough, anything and everything could and did happen, because they believe this is the only possible explanation, and here we are.
A long slow development would argue that life arose by chance, because even very unlikely events can happen, if you wait long enough.
If a teacher walked into a biology classroom, wheeling a cart with a large container of water and numerous beakers of different chemicals, and then said, "I will mix chemicals together in water, and in 7 seconds we will have a living, functional cell," he or she would be laughed out of the room. If they then suggested 7 minutes, 7 hours, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years, 7 decades, 7 centuries, 7 millennia, and 7 million years, the laughing would slowly die down and the students would become more serious. When they declare 700 million years, from 4.6 billion to 3.9 billion, heads would nod in agreement, because that's the figure we have been taught to believe was required for the appearance of the first life, or protozoa, at 3.9 billion years ago. Just add enough magical time, and miracles happen. This is not a foolish creationist illustration, but the essence of what Stephen Jay Gould said he was taught by biologist George Wald.
Still, life is so staggeringly complex that its origin from simple chemicals must have consumed an immense amount of time. Only the immensity of time guaranteed the result, for time converts the improbable to the inevitable. Wald wrote in 1954, "Time is in fact the hero of the plot. The time with which we have to deal is the order of 2 billion years. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs the miracles." The spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet, here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation.
Now, why is faith in a God who can do anything ignorant mythology, while faith in miracle-working time and spontaneous generation, which Wald himself declared to be impossible, portrayed as reason and science? I have concluded that determining which ideas are ignorant mythology as opposed to reason and science is primarily a matter of who controls the microphone, publishing companies, and universities. It seems that materialists are not really opposed to faith in miracles. They just don't like God. However, deep time leads to a problem for evolutionary thinking that few promoters seem to recognize. It was noted bluntly in a book by Henry G., a well-known paleontologist who served as a senior editor for the science journal Nature. He said the imagined time span is so huge that it is ridiculous to arrange a group of fossils, each separated from the others by what is believed to be hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and then claim that one is descended from another. In response to rebellion, Genesis 3:17-19 tells us that God placed a curse on the natural order. cursed ground, toil, sweat, weeds and thorns, living things dying and their bodies decomposing into basic elements. To contradict the curse in Eden, secularists imagined an inherently self-organizing natural order, in which early, simple, and primitive forms always evolve towards later, complex, advanced forms. With the Bible removed, they believed that nature and European civilization would resume inherent evolutionary progress. However, in the 19th century, work with steam engines eventually revealed that natural processes have an inherent tendency toward decline and disorder. It was called the second principle of thermodynamics, and it argued, contrary to optimistic naturalism, that nature was not inherently organizing, but was disorganizing from an earlier, highly ordered state.
To say that there is an obvious tendency of nature from disorder to order and organization, and to advance this idea to a fourth law, is to misunderstand completely and to compromise all of thermodynamics.
In their zeal to demolish the Bible, 18th century French philosophers rejected the biblical curse and everyday experience so as to embrace an optimistic materialistic naturalism, imagining nature to be inherently self-ordering. For those common enough to still have some sense, experience tells us that everything around us, including our bodies, tend to decay over time. Michio Kaku has referred to this as an iron law of physics.
Man has long been aware that his world has a tendency to fall apart. Tools wear out, fishing nets need repair, roofs leak, iron rusts, wood decays, loved ones sicken and die, relatives quarrel, and nations make war.
If I blew up a nice outhouse, which did not come into existence by random natural processes, and I would be an intelligent agent causing the explosion, observation and experience would not cause me to expect that natural processes would cause the fragments to accidentally fall into place so as to produce a beautiful new mansion, or even a one-room shack. Instead, the remnants would further disintegrate. However, as with Hollywood, anything is possible in the imagination of those willing to consider any answer except in the beginning God created. Because it continually reminds us that the upward evolutionary progress scenario is imaginary nonsense, it tends to be ignored or downplayed by those devoted to promoting materialistic naturalism and inherent evolutionary progress.
An uninvited guest at any discussion of the origin of life and of evolution, from the materialistic reductionist point of view, is the role of thermodynamic entropy and the heat death of the universe, which it predicts.
While materialists assert that the universe itself is a closed system of natural processes, when Darwinists are confronted with the second principle, they try to salvage their scenario by asserting that the disorder tendency can be overcome in an open system where energy is supplied, such as sunlight hitting the Earth. They fail to note that dumping raw energy on something is not a good answer, for raw energy is destructive unless there is already a designed energy utilization system in place. Dumping 5 gallons of gasoline on your car is not useful. It has to be funneled into a fuel system that was designed to handle it beneficially. Sun energy doesn't do anything good for vegetation unless it is alive and has a functioning chlorophyll system in place. Some physicists have noted that the second principle doesn't break down under any circumstances.
There is thus no justification for the view, often glibly repeated, that the second law of thermodynamics is only statistically true, in the sense that microscopic violations repeatedly occur, but never violations of any serious magnitude. On the contrary, no evidence has ever been presented that the second law breaks down under any circumstances.
This was reiterated in a 2015 article published in the Scientific American. The universe is dying, slowly. If natural processes are generally tending toward increasing disorder, rather than progressing upwardly, then that alone should invalidate the entire optimistic Enlightenment scenario, in which the universe is imagined to be creating itself and inherently evolving toward ever higher levels of order. If any scenario is an imaginary fairy tale, it is materialistic naturalism.